Dr. A. Conway Lake, before he retired, was reader in the Department of Welsh at Swansea University, and he's edited the works of a number of poets from the Middle Ages, and he was part of the team which produced the electronic edition of David ap Gwynllan's works. He has taken an interest in the literature of the 18th century and edited collections of ballads and plays, such as by Elisa Cowper. So, Dr. Conwell, we're looking forward eagerly to your address, and thank you very much for being with us this morning. Well, good morning to you all. And thank you for the invitation and the kind introduction, and it's good to have your company, although I can't see anybody of you on the screen in front of me. No, Alice Wynne doesn't really deserve his place in this series of talks celebrating the contribution of the Church to Welsh literature and culture. His career virtually came to an end as a writer in 1703 with the publication of Gweledigaethau Bardd Cwsg. It was only 2 years that his formal connection with the church began. He was ordained a deacon and priest a week later in December 1704 and appointed in 1705 to be rector of the parish of Llandanog and Llanbadr near Harlech in Meirionnydd. But I'm sure nobody would complain that we are going to look at one of the authors, one of the classics of our prose, one of the most original works of his age, and which has been read avidly by generations of Welsh people. In the century before Ellis Wynne was born, about one book a year was published in Welsh on average. Most of them were religious and devotional works. Many were translations from English, and most of those translations were produced by the churchmen. That fact shouldn't surprise us. Many of these clergymen belong to gentry families, or at least families with more resources than most people. As a result, they'd been educated in grammar schools, and some had gone on to study at university. Most of the Welsh went to Oxford. We'd have to wait till the end of the 19th century before we'd have a college in Wales. The church was the obvious career for those who returned to Wales. That career offered a comfortable living by the standards of the age, time to read and meditate, and time to set aside for challenging and laborious tasks like translation. And these considerations are relevant as we think of the background of work of Ellis Wynne and Theophilus Evans. We'll hear more about, of course, later on this morning. Ellis Wynne was connected to some of the old gentry families of Dydwyn Davionedd. He was born in Lasynys, his mother's home, in 1671. The substantial house is on the left as you travel on the B4573 between Harlech and Tylsawnau. And it's a physical symbol of the status and worldly position of Ellis Wynne. The house has been restored by now, and if you haven't been there yet, do take the opportunity when restrictions are raised and when it's easier to travel and stay the night to go there. The small manor house of Glencoach in Tylsawnau isn't far away, and Ellis Wynne was connected to the Wynnes of Glencoach through his father. Ellis went to Oxford in 1692 at 21 years of age, and he returned to his native area and got married in 1698. In 1705, as we've noted, he was given the rectorship of Llandanog and Llanbedr, 2 parishes to the south of Harlech. In 1711, he gave these 2 parishes up and became rector of Llanfair. Llandanog and Llanbedr, about 5 miles from Lasynys. and Llanfair was only 3 miles away, so 2 miles less to travel to church. He held that living until he died in 1734, and he was succeeded by his son Edward. We remember Ellis Wynne for 2 prose works. The first was a translation of the work by Jeremy Taylor, The Rule and Exercises of Holy Living. Taylor's work circulated widely. It appeared first of all in 1650, and 15 editions had been produced by 1690. Ellis's translation, Rheol Buched Sanctaidd, which was published in 1701, is in the late of religious works which were translated into Welsh before his time and continue to be published throughout the 19th century. The success of the church was important for Ellis and the other translators, and he wished to see the church go from strength to strength. But the spiritual situation of his fellow Welsh people was important to him as well, and the translation evidences his desire to train and explain and set his people on the path of Christian living according to the teaching of the Bible. Gweledigaethau Bardd Cwsg appeared 2 years later in 1703. In terms of literary output, he wasn't completely idle as a rector. He oversaw a revision of the Book of Bromley Prayer in 1710, which were being used regularly in the church's service, and he wrote some poetry, although most of them were only seen in print after his death. Gweledigaethau, The Visions, is the work that makes him such an important figure in our literary history. The Gweledigaethau were welcomed immediately because of the language, the content, and the style. There were 2 editions during Ellis Wynne's own life, and 30 and more during the 2 centuries after he died in 1734. There was more than 1 translation to English. To those listening in English, the quotations come from Robert Gwynllan Davies's translation of 1897. Although it was known from the start who wrote the Gweledigaethau, it was only in 1806 that Ellis Wynne appeared on the title page for the first time. In distinction to Rheol Buched Sanctaidd, the Gweledigaethau isn't a translation, but it's not completely original either. As we were discussing Ellis Wynne's works many years ago, Gwynllan reminded us that originality wasn't considered one of the virtues of being a writer in the 18th century. It was very acceptable to adapt and rehash other people's work. And we need to look to Spain, to Los Sueños, a work by Don Francisco de Quevedo Villegas, who lived between 1580 and 1645. His work circulated in manuscripts in the first place, and then it was published and became incredibly popular. There were 2 translations into English by Dr. Lestrange in 1667 and John Stevens in 1682. Ellis Wynne used Lestrange and Stevens' English texts. Rather than translating word for word, what he did was pick and choose. The English idiom cherry picking describes what he did. He adopted ideas, descriptions, situations, and then produced a completely new totality, which is very different in content and form to the original. Ellis Wynne's step to Lestrange and Stevens is obvious, but we have to add that they were not his only sources. He used John Milton's Paradise Lost and John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress and borrowed from them as well. If we were to translate the Spanish title, it would be The Dreams, but Roger Lestrange uses Visions in his translation. And Ellis Wynne used Gweledigaethau Visions as a title for his work. In it, Ellis Wynne, as the sleeping poet, sleeps, dreams, and is taken to 3 different places. The first vision is of the present world, and then we go into the kingdom of death in the second, and to hell in the third. We see his originality when we look at the total work and the form of each vision. There were 7 visions in the original. Ellis Wynne has 3. The original was a bit disconnected, and the death and the judgment came before the vision of the world. Ellis Wynne's system is more logical. The world, death, and hell. The 3 visions start in a different place and at different times. At the start of the first vision, we are on the summit on one of Wales's mountains, looking over the Irish Sea. The mention of Glyn Cywarch, his ancestors on his father's side, and Cadair Idris set the second vision in Meirionnydd. The third opens on the banks of the Severn, but still within Wales. You'll see immediately the way that Ellis Wynne put a Welsh stamp on his material. The reader wouldn't imagine for the moment that the gweledigaethau came from a foreign source. In terms of time, it's summer in the first vision, on a fine evening of a warm and mellow summer, the season of fullness and perfection. By the end of that vision, though, we realise that things aren't as wonderful as they appeared at the beginning. It is winter in the second, and that, of course, sets the scene for visiting the kingdom of death. And it's spring in this last vision, when new life and energy reappears after the winter. And the reader gets quite shocked, realizing that he's going to visit the horrors of hell this time. Every vision has its different landscape as well. The world is represented by a city with streets, buildings, courts, gates, and treasuries, with a church which is part of the city and yet a part. Frogs, worms, gravestones are seen in the kingdom of death, and every cave, every cliff in hell faces downwards. The language that Ellis Wynne used is another original element. There's a lot of description in the gweledigaethau. The vocabulary is rich. The sentences are long and multi-clause. And everything is in its place and works together. And this is what happened in the translation produced before Ellis Wynne's times, including the work of William Morgan, his Bible. This is a description of the court of a king death in his second vision. And I think my PowerPoint is working out. No, it isn't. So this is the quotation about the court of the king of death. Its walls were built of human skulls with hideous grinning teeth. The clay was black with mingled tears and sweat, the lime ruddy with gore. And the pillars of the hall were made of thigh bones and the pallor of shin bones, while the floors were formed of layer upon layer of all manner of charnel. But that's not the only kind of language. There's a lot of dialogue in the visions, and more than half of the second vision is a dialogue. On this journey, Bardd Cwsg meets all sorts of characters and talks to them. But also he has a guide who leads him to the world, to the kingdom of death and to hell. One interesting thing in the work is the relationship between the sleeping bard and his guide. The sleeping bard, of course, is an inexperienced traveller. Everything he sees is new and unfamiliar, and he has loads of questions. And the angel says, now slow down, one question at once. Through these questions and answers, the sleeping bard and ourselves as readers come to learn about the places visited. But gradually, the traveller becomes more confident and responds to the people he sees and the situations he finds himself in. We share in his shock, his surprise, his commiseration and his pride. It's the natural colloquial language includes wit that puts a smile on our faces. The sentences can be short and catchy, and the vocabulary sometimes is quite coarse. He uses words like fool, Gwinllan, witch, and he doesn't keep people at arm's length, but Hydwyn at arse's length, literally. And talking about bodies at Birgin is not a decent way to talk, and he talks about the shit house of Lucifer. And we'd have no time to stand and wait. Everything happens so quickly. And there is a staccato movement to his narrative. Ellis Wynne was really a pioneer in using the vernacular in his work. The work is full of people, categories rather than individuals. One thing that gives unity to the work is that we follow these categories from one place to another, from one state to another. Who is there? There's a long list. We see many lawyers and officers of the court, shopkeepers, traders, publicans, money lenders, thieves and murderers. We meet women, some of them of doubtful morals, others who spent their time in front of the mirror putting on their makeup, and others who only think about their clothes and accessories. There are poets, and I have to say, some priests as well. There are fiddlers and loads of drunks. All these categories are connected to the world, or the wicked city, as it's called, because of their misbehavior, and they are punished for that in the kingdom of heaven and in hell. This is a religious and didactic work at heart. There is comment on the lives people led at the time, on values and behaviour, and everything is seen as unacceptable. And the fate of the people described is a warning to others, a warning to repent and turn to a moral life. So both prose works of Ellis Wynne, even though they're so different, do have similarities. What is done in the translation Rheol Bucher Sanctaidd is to give guidance in rules for the Christian about how he's lived to his life from day to day, what he should do. The proper behaviour is noted: rising in the morning, at work, eating, and in supervising his family and servants. And in the visions, we're told what not to do and what happens if you live an ungodly life. The encouragement is clear at the end of the visit to the kingdom of death. In the second vision, I was only gazing from a distance, yet I beheld more dreadful horrors than I can now relate. My my soul came back to the land of the living, and I resolved to lead a better life, for I would rather suffer affliction 100 years in the paths of holiness than perforce take another glance at the horrors of that night. Does Ellis Wynn succeed to encourage change and improvement? There's been much discussion of this question. The author's main weapon is satire, and he's a master of that. As he describes the behaviour of the members of the categories that he talks about, how they looked, how they spoke, etc. It's just a little cameo, even though there will need to be some explanation. And many an ambling fop who might winnow beans by the wind of his train. A scoggin is somebody who behaves in an effeminate way, whose body is moving all the time. And he uses a word that's spoken of horses in their movement. And the picture is that this person walks in a way which draws everybody's attention, his limbs, and especially his tail, which is his backside, are just moving all the time, as if somebody was using a sieve. And so the movement of his backside makes us think of a huge fan which produce a great wind, so you don't need a sieve to winnow the grain. And he talks of the wind from his tail, that a terrible smell was coming from his behind. He looks fine in clothes, etc. But you want to read too close to him, and certainly not behind him. And excerpts such as this obviously were enjoyed by the readership. The satire makes these individuals undesirable and comic in our view. The trouble is with satire is that we smile at these characters, but we're seeing others, not ourselves. It doesn't lead us to change and improve. There are comic portions as well. Think about the character Medlayor, that is a gossip, who says to the King Lucifer in hell that some of his servants have been neglecting their duties, have been sleeping on the job. The Goleuedigaethau have a serious intent, that is improving people's lives, but the message doesn't necessarily hit home. Emrys ap Iwan hit the nail on the head when he compared Ellis Wynn to an undertaker who had this serious face and this voice tremulous, and raises a handkerchief to his face, not really to dry a tear, but to hide a smile. I hope that these comments have convinced you that readers today will enjoy Ellis Wynn's Goleuedigaethau, even it was 3 centuries. It's been 3 centuries since it was published. If you turn to the Goleuedigaethau, you will notice several things for today. This was an age of today is the age of extremes and full of fake news, etc. And every criticism, even constructive criticism, is interpreted as a challenge and an attack. Maybe the visions tell us that it was always like that. because Ellis Wynn is definitely an intolerant writer, especially about religious things. He was a proud churchman who was loyal to the crown and the government, and he had not a good word to say about sects and other religions. The fact that the sleeping bag meets members of these on his journey and they become objects of his satire speaks volumes. The nonconformists are the people of the barn. The Quakers are backless dogs. And he doesn't hide his hatred for these groups. He's totally one-sided as well, in that everyone is described as wicked. There is no distinction. Everybody is on their way to hell. Who would Ellis Wynn put in the kingdom of death and hell if you were writing today? And if you who are listening this morning were to produce a work like Gweledigaethau, what classes of people would you describe? We read daily unprincipled politicians who use the public purse to fill the pockets of their friends and supporters, about drug dealers who do not only destroy lives but who attack and kill others in order to safeguard their market, about scams who invent so many ways of stealing innocent people's money. In Ellis Wynn's day, the problem was highwaymen. Now it's information highwaymen were a problem, maybe. And he raises important questions about the nature of punishment, for example, and the punishment in the kingdom of death and hell fit the crime. Here he talks about what happens to the drunkard and the prostitute. Tie them both face to face because they're old friends and throw them into the world of darkness and let him vomit into her mouth and let her piss fire into his innards until the day of judgment. One thing is certain, we need more than a dose of satire to improve our society today. Thank you for listening, and I'm sorry about the problem with the PowerPoint. Well, thank you very much. The great thing about recording this is that we can get rid of any hiccups like that, so it'll look completely smooth on the Church in Wales website. Well, thank you very much. We've had a feast already this morning, and I didn't really know a lot about the work of Ellis Wynn, but we've really been inspired to read it and to consider the subjects that he raises as well. A question has come in. You've started to answer this, really, by the end of your talk, but the question is, the visions seem quite different to Jeremy Taylor's work in terms of structure and style, but they both had the same intent of improving the lives of readers. What has Ellis Wynn work to say to us, to challenge us as church and society today? Is that a question to me or a question to everyone? Well, that is a question. I finished by suggesting that Ellis Wynn was quite single-minded in looking at every kind of sin and misdemeanor and painting everybody with the same brush. But what I didn't mention is that the only good in these visions, according to Ellis Wynn, is the church. the climax of the first scene is when he's seen all the world, and he arrives at the church, and of course it's the Church of England, and the Queen Anne is there on her throne, ruling the state and church, and that's the paragon, that's the ideal for Ellis Wynn. And that's a threat, the threat to the kingdom of death at the end of the second vision is the church. So he's a very loyal churchman, and he is politically completely loyal to the powers that be. That's all I can say about Ellis Wynn. I don't think it's my place to go on to answer that question in full, but maybe we can have a discussion about that later on. So he wasn't one of the most ecumenical people, was he? He had nothing to say about any other sect. He came down very heavily on them. He was very intolerant, as I suggested. He was so faithful to the church. He didn't see any value in the other sects. He just admits there's a little bit of good in them all, but it's really criticism that we get from him, no approval. A number of interesting questions have come in. One person says, "Thank you very much for your paper. Have you any do you think he he felt any tension using the works of nonconformists like Bunyan and Milton?" Well, he took his ideas from all sorts of directions. What I've tried to emphasize is that there was a lot of what we'd call plagiarism by now, but that was the norm in the 18th century. And Ellis Wynn had taken these ideas from works he'd read, including Pilgrim's Progress by Bunyan, and the work of Milton, etc. One interesting point that arises is that when the work was first published, it's called Gweled Bar Cwrs, the first part. We never had the second part, and the people have been thinking, what would have been that second part if Ellis Wynn had actually produced what he hoped to do? In the visions that we have the evil world. We have the kingdom of death full of evil people, and hell, the place of punishment. The suggestion is that he would have produced three visions, illustrating the opposite. That is the kingdom of the world with good people. There's only one good man in the first vision going to the church, and he's looking very sad. But if he had produced the second part, he might have described the good world, described the kingdom of death. Everybody dies. What would happen to the people who'd led a good life? And then hell in the last vision. A picture of heaven. But it didn't happen. And throughout the centuries, authors and artists and poets have been more effective in describing negative aspects of humanity rather than positive aspects. Certainly Ellis Wynn has done that. It's the negative picture that's important. Well, maybe he was doing that with a bit of smile on his face. But no, we didn't get our second part, even though it's a suggestion that Ellis Wynn had intended in the first place to do that. Thank you. St. Daniel, maybe we need to consider Dante's Divine Comedy as one of the influences on the sleeping poets. In the comedy, Dante is led to hell first and then into heaven by no less than Virgil. What would you say about Justin's comment there? Well, that connects to a comment I made a minute ago, that there are descriptions of death and hell. That's a very fair comment. There was a lot of literature to do with visions and dreams, and to do with death and hell as well. So the Gweledigaetha is part of that big picture, and it's significant that it's a poet who guides Dante, and the sleeping bird was a figure in Welsh poetry before Ellis Wynne's time, and Ellis Wynne actually took the title of a real Welsh poet who lives in the Middle Ages, and Ellis Wynne actually meets a real sleeping poet on his journeys, and he's not very happy with Ellis Wynne at all for stealing his name, and has actually done him a disfavour by taking his name, and that is a lovely part where Ellis Wynne, the sleeping poet, meets the real Bardd Cwsg. And yesterday's comment is interesting because it is a poet who does the journey in Ellis Wynne's work as well. One question before we have a little break, and I know, Dr. Cynwell, you'll be ready to have a formal chat in the Zoom room at the end. Yes, great. One final question. Is there information about the kind of reception the Gweledigaethau had from the contemporary readership? It was published more than once, 30 editions in the period following Ellis Wynne's age, and just one element of the reception of the work. Several ideas in the Gweledigaethau appear in other works, especially in popular works and ballads. And the interludes, the short plays, were popular literature in the 18th century, especially the work of Twm Nant, for example. One of them based on the first vision, when the sleeping poet visits 3 streets in the wicked city. The street of Pride, and for example, and there's a description in the ballads, a description of Pride, which closely echo the wording used by Ellis Wynne in the Gweledigaethau. So the playwrights and the ballad writers stole some of the ideas and some of the exact wording from Ellis Wynne in their works. Certainly, the Gweledigaethau had become very popular in its own age, and the fact that it was republished so many times shows that very clearly. Well, thank you very much. Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time now, but we've had a very interesting morning so far. So thank you very much, Dr. Cynwell, for giving us such a great start to our webinar this morning. Well, I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Hugh Price, who is going to address us now on salvation, providence and history, Theophilus Evans and Drych y Prif. Hugh Price was Professor of Welsh History in Bangor University, and he's Professor Emeritus then now. His 2 main fields is history of Wales in the Middle Ages and history of Welsh law. He's produced Native Law and the Church Medieval Wales, the Acts of Welsh Rulers, and J. Lloyd and the Creation of Welsh History. He's working in a volume about how the Welsh history was written from the Middle Ages until the beginning of the present century. So thank you very much, Professor Hugh. Thank you very much for that kind introduction and the invitation to take part in these webinars. I'll try to share my screen. There it is. I hope everybody can see the slides now. Well, in 1716, a young man of 23 years old who wanted to be a priest in the Church of England. The most popular book on Welsh history since Geoffrey Monmouth's works in the 12th century. The title of the volume was Drych y Prif Oesoedd, which meant the earliest ages. And the author, Theophilus Evans, was born in 1693 from a noble family in the south of Cardiganshire, known for their loyalty to the crown during the Civil War. His connections with the gentry in the area who were interested in antiquarianism and history helped him in his interest in Welsh history, and he was able to use the library of William Lewis of Llwynderw and the library and manuscripts of Samuel Williams, the victor of Llandyfriog, who was the father of the antiquarian Moses Williams, who we'll talk about later. Well, Theophilus Evans and his knowledge of Latin suggests that he was educated formally, possibly in Carmarthen Grammar School, even though there is no evidence that he went to university. He was ordained a deacon in 1717 and then a priest in 1718. And until his death in 1767, he served several parishes in Breconshire, except when he was in Llandyfriog in Cardiganshire in the 1720s. He was a committed preacher and minister and wrote many religious works, most of them in Welsh, in order to promote what he believed the only true religion, the Protestantism of the Church of England. It's not surprising, therefore, that he was very critical of Catholics, but also the Methodists and nonconformism in general, which is reflected in his most important English book, The History of Modern Enthusiasm. And he had very intolerant ideas, similarly to Ellie Swyn that we heard about earlier. The Drych y Prif Oesoedd was a religious work as well, even though history was the medium for that. What was the book then? What was its significance? Well, the first thing to emphasize is that Theophilus Evans had combined two important aspects of the understanding of the Welsh people of their history. The first, dating from medieval times, the second from the Protestant Reformation period. That is the glorious roots of the Welsh from the Britons who lost the sovereignty of the island of Britain because of their sins, and interpretations of the Protestant Reformation as a restoration of the independent British Church, which was independent of Catholicism to start with, and therefore a Protestant church. He has an attractive style, and that also helped to make the work popular. He published two versions of the book, as you'll see on the screen. The first one in 1716, and a revised, longer version in 1740. In terms of content, the most important addition to the second version was further detail about the alleged history of Prince Madog of Owain Gwynedd discovering American at the end of the 12th century. History had to become politically important because of the war between England and Britain and Spain in the Caribbean. And he included a report from the end of the 17th century about Welsh-speaking Indians who were mixed-race people, sadly descended from the medieval Welsh migrants, and together with Native Americans. And this book became very popular as the second version was reprinted 17 times between 1794 and 1899, and also translated into English in the USA in 1834, The View of the Primitive Ages. So, for over a century, this was the most popular book on the history of Wales, even though it was read mostly as a literary work, as Robin Chapman has argued. This morning, though, I will be concentrating on the first edition, 1716, which was republished by Garfield Hughes in 1961. It was about 300 pages long and divided in two parts. It's an ambitious work, even though Theophilus describes it as a booklet in one place. Even though the motivations of the work are pretty clear generally, we can only guess why Theophilus decided to write when he did. Maybe one clue comes from the Latin dedication to Adam Otley, Bishop of St. David's. So you see the start of that on the left there. As well as exhibiting the author's ability in Latin. Latin was a practical choice because Otley, who was from Shropshire, could not speak Welsh. Again, he's considered one of the most effective bishops in Wales in the 18th century. He actually lived in his diocese most of the time, and he employed Welsh-speaking priests and was a patron of Welsh literature. And he says here that the bishop is a true successor to St. David's, and the most ardent defender of Orthodox religion, which the book was trying to do as well. So, if Theophilus Evans wanted to raise further his ecclesiastical ambitions, he would have been able to write in English. But really, he probably wanted to make an impression as a scholar and wanted to produce a work which the bishop would approve of. We can also suggest that Theophilus had been encouraged to write a book, not because of his great interest in the history of the Welsh and the church, but also to take advantage of the interest in history among the Welsh readership, which is reflected in the historical content in many almanacs from the 17th century onwards. So his audience was farmers and other literate people rather than the illiterate masses. That might explain why John Randech from Shrewsbury was ready to produce the work without insisting on subscriptions. And Sean Randech started soon after to produce almanacs, including historical sections, which include biblical history and events from Welsh history, from the appearance of Brutus in Wales until the death in Britain until the death of Llywelyn in 1282. Those events are included in the first part of the Drych, which is about 40% of the whole volume, which takes us from the history of the Welsh, from their alleged beginnings as the descendants of Gomer, son of Japhet, son of Noah, through to the death of Llywelyn of Gruffydd in 1282, and concentrates on the period between the conquest of Britain by the Romans and the death of King Arthur, and actually rushes through the Age of the Princes in only 7 pages. The last chapter of the first part goes back to the age of the Druids and discusses the morals of the old Britons and the Welsh language, and ends with praising Dafydd ap Gwilym. And the language is actually introduced as the badge of Welsh nationhood when he says, and the quoted on screen, that the Welsh, despite all their difficulties, could boast, even though we were conquered by the Romans and the English, that we've kept our original language, maybe not perfectly, but more purely than any nation in the world. The emphasis on the language is significant. When he started work on the Drych, he had only just realised how rich the Welsh language was as a medium, and he uses the vernacular language as well as language from his literary background, even though he translated 2 short works before he wrote the Drych. This was the first original work he produced in Welsh, and he was insistent on using the language to avoid the way it was not being used as he would wish. It's no wonder that Theophilus Evans, similarly to authors before him, rejoices in the ability of the language to remain pure for thousands of years. Its presence on the pages of the book was therefore a visible link between the past and the present. There is a more obvious religious aspect of the second part of the book, which starts with the early history of Christianity in Britain, from the appearance of faith through Joseph of Arimathea during Apostolic Age, until that pure faith was lost as the Britons became victims of the Roman Catholic Church in the 9th century, a situation which was rescued by the Protestant Reformation and the translation of the Bible into Welsh in the 16th century. The anti-English patriotism of the author is obvious throughout these chapters, including the derogatory references to Augustine of Canterbury, who was trying to bring the Welsh Church under the authority of Rome. But the rest of the second part is of a different bent, a defence of the Church of England, as Theophilus Evans tries to prove that the forms of worship, etc., of that church were based on an evangelical form, which was there before Catholicism took over. took over. These were the first ages of the early church, when which was only scripture, which was the foundation. He talks about the ministry, baptism, communion, and makes it clear that these are still relevant to us today. And he notes that no one was allowed to leave the church, and if any fanatic tried to set up another sect, they would be condemned absolutely. And he emphasizes also the obedience of the early Christians to the government. The William Lewis in his blurb, in a way, at the beginning of the volume, is interesting. He talks of Theophilus Evans as being the first for 500 or 600 years to write about Welsh history in Wales, the only exception being the short work of the Puritan Charles Edwards, and says that the Drych makes a not insignificant contribution to the knowledge and the training of people in the true faith. So the history in the work is part of its wider religious intent to ensure the salvation of the readers. So, similar to the Gwledigaethau Bawr Cwsg, Felys Wyn, it's a didactic and religious work. And that's reinforced by the verse from Psalm 77 at the bottom of the frontispiece of the book, which reads, I considered the earlier days, the years of past ages, where the psalm is seeking solace from the present disasters by remembering the good works of God in the past. And in the preface to the reader, Theophilus Evans says about the early history of the Welsh. He quotes the warnings of Moses to the Israelites if they were disobedient to the word of God. Here you will see a true picture of the fruits of sin and the different effect of a good life and a wicked life. And you'll see that when our ancestors acted according to the will of God, that no enemy could succeed against them, but when they went after the desires and the disobedience of their own hearts, the enemy came upon them and trod them down very low, as in Deuteronomium there. The religious intent of the work explains why Theophilus Evans, although he uses Geoffrey of Monmouth regularly, he doesn't actually do so in an uncritical way. Without going into detail, doubts had arisen since the 16th century concerning Geoffrey's history, from Brutus of Troy through to Cadwalder Fendigaid in the 7th century. The history translated into Welsh as Brit y Brenhinedd. There were questions about whether that history was dependable, or what did it come from the imagination of Geoffrey or his source. In first place, Theophilus Evans followed the English antiquarian William Camden, who wrote Britannia in 1586, by insisting that the Britons and their successors, the Welsh, were from Gomer, son of Japhet, a biblical beginning, and so he adapts the history of Geoffrey by portraying Brutus as not the conqueror of Britain, but a later leader who was proclaimed king by the Britons because he introduced a more civilized way of life, literacy and agriculture, for instance. And also it suggested that the Greek elements in Welsh came through Brutus. And secondly, the Greek narrative jumps ahead to the conquest of Britain by the Romans and says that many people doubt what is said about the kings between Brutus and the Romans. That's why he doesn't mention that and says that history is trivial anyway. That's a good example of the way the author deals with his sources in a critical way to a degree. And he uses other critical work by scholars like William Calden, Edward Llwyd, James Asher, and Edward Stillingfleet, even though that their scholarship wasn't so deep as it appears, because they only copied from other sources in their works. Nevertheless, it's obvious that Theophilus Evans did read many medieval sources, especially to go back to the narrative of the Drych, even though he still follows Geoffrey of Monmouth in speaking of events between the coming of the Romans and the English conquest. He uses Gildas, Bede, and other sources. Gildas is especially important in this respect, not only because of the knowledge that is introduced, but of his particular use of history. A monk in Britain in the 6th century, Gildas was well known for his Latin work, De Excidio Britannia, The Loss of Britain, a work which explains the English Anglo-Saxon conquest on the island as the punishment by God of the Britons for their sins. In the last part of the work, Gildas addresses the kings and the church leaders of his age, encourage them to improve their lives lest they suffer in the way their ancestors did. And he underlines his message by quoting frequently from the Bible, especially the Old Testament prophets, comparing to the Britons to Israel, and they are actually called the Israel of today in one place. So Gildas is following the pattern of the Old Testament prophets by calling these people to repent. So Theophilus Evans wasn't the first author in Wales to quote Gildas, a true historian, if there ever was one, as it says, and his providential interpretation of the history of Welsh. Charles Edwards, for example, was influenced by him, the author of A Ffydd i Fiant. But what needs to be emphasized here is that Theophilus Evans shared Gildas's judgment that history has important lessons, whether that's at a warning or an inspiration. An example is his desire find a usable past, to borrow the term coined by Van Wyck Brooks over a century ago, which is an attempt to pick and choose from elements of the past to create a new work which is relevant for today. Of course, there was nothing unusual in this. Just looking at the early modern period only, we can list a host of historical works which found in the past the roots or the justification for contemporary religious or political standpoints. So think about the work of the convinced Protestant Paul de Rappenthwara, who published his History of England originally in French in 1724-7 and translated it into English soon afterwards. This popular work introduces the history of England as a matter of a fight for freedom, and suggests it's a mixed constitution based on the balance between king and parliament. He traces that back to the Anglo-Saxons, that reached its climax in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which set the Protestant King William of Orange and his wife Mary on the throne. That interpretation isn't surprising, because Rapin reads the past in the light of his personal experience as an Huguenot exile from France, who crossed from the Netherlands to England with the Duke William, as he was then, at the time of the Glorious Revolution. So a measure of the difference between the historical works in England and Wales at the time is that the Drych looked at a very early period and concentrated that, and for the most part ignored later political developments, and Rapin as well, except that the Britons were descended from Gomer. Theophilus Evans was and also Theophilus Evans supported the constitutional settlement of Britain following the Union of Scotland in 1707. But that's not his main focus. In the first part of his work moves quickly from the ancient roots of the Welsh to their history in the time of the Romans, and especially the centuries after the Romans left Britain, and therefore concentrates on the period after the Britons became Christians. And of course, Christianity is the emphasis of his second part of the book. So it suggested that the history of the Britons and the Welsh, in terms of the Christian God's providence, and following Gildas, Theophilus, and the quote is at the top of the screen, the concept that it was because of God's judgment on us that we were exiled to the poorest parts of the island, that is Wales and Cornwall. So, and he has a mixed attitude to the instrument of that punishment, the English. Well, he agrees that the present English people are a big improvement on their ancestors. Indeed, they were saved in order in order to celebrate real religion after the Protestant Reformation. But Theophilus Evans also is very critical of the English. It should also be added that anti-Englishness of the kind wasn't unusual among patriotic Welsh churchmen of the time. I think of the scholar Moses Williams, who was to whom Theophilus was a curate for a time, in a sermon to the Welsh in London, 1717, about the dangers of Anglicisation, and encouraged them to take more pride in their language and their country, lest that some of the descendants of that nation which took England from us might take Wales from us as well, and actually destroy us from under heaven. Notice the reference to the Anglo-Saxon conquests, which was dealt with in more detail in Edrych. But also, we read that most of the Britons fled to Brittany to escape the Yellow Plague, and therefore it wasn't by force of arms or by ability that the English conquered England, but just by an accident, because the country was empty of people. An interpretation which recognized the punishment of God but didn't give the glory to the English. On the other hand, Theophilus Evans says that the King Arthur defended the Britons powerfully, and hated the English with a pure hatred, because therefore that's why the English wanted to destroy Arthur's good name when they couldn't kill him himself. And Theophilus Evans also talks about the Welsh having their own laws and keeping them until the conquest of Edward I, until we were tricked into accepting English law, as the king presented his newborn son to the Welsh in Carnarvon in response to their quest for a prince who could speak no word of English. So Theophilus Evans suggests that the Welsh failed because of their sins, and yet they were defended by God and protected despite their conquest by their neighbours. To summarise, yes, Drych y Prif Oesoedd is a work of history. It's actually called a history often in the text, but it is a history which uses the past for present motivations, which is the motivations of a churchman and a patriotic Welshman in the 18th century. Even there are some critical elements. The Drych would not be worthy of the description of a critical history from modern sense. And Gwynllan a century ago condemned it as a novel. And but Drych y Prif Oesoedd is a way of reminding us of the essential link between the past and the present. The need to find a usable past is still there, and of course controversial as individuals and different organisations produce interpretations of history which reflect their own political and ideological stances. Theophilus wasn't the first or the last to appeal to history in order to justify ideas and hopes for the present. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Professor Hugh. We had another feast, and it's interesting to think about how political and literary and religious aspects all weave together and how some attitudes have changed over time and some haven't. Thank you very much. We have 2 questions that have come in, and I'm afraid I have to ask you to respond briefly, because we don't want to go much beyond 11:30. But the first question is, to what extent do you think that the religious dimension of the Drych has been recognised by the Welsh in later years? A good question. I get the impression that it's a history and the way it's written, that it's an entertaining work to read, and that it actually feeds the pride of the Welsh, is the most important thing for people. But it is striking, and we need to think more carefully about this, that there was quite a gap between the production of the 2 first versions, and it's only to the 1790s that it becomes really popular, and then right through the 19th century. Well, so it was considered more as a work of history, even though over half of the work deals with the church, and that tends to be forgotten. And to be honest, I haven't studied the response in detail. Robin Chapman has written in the Transactions of the Cymrodorion about the response to work in the 19th century, and he emphasised that it was the literary aspects and an interest in the author that was important. But if I had to put my head on the block, I would say it was a history that appealed most. And the last question, remember everybody, there we have the link in the chat boxes for the chat with the kappa at the end. Anyway, the last question. You mentioned a Whig interpretation of history in the 18th century. Are there Whig elements in Drych y Prif Oeser, or is it a Tory interpretation for the most part? Well, it's more likely that Tory, that Theophilus would have seen himself as a Tory. He's very, has a very conservative attitude, and he wrote a gentleman's magazine and saying that the history of Mad Dog and the Welsh Indians proves England's claim to America, and criticises Spain. And then he quotes Britain's Strike Home, which was a popular song at the time. So he would have emphasised obedience to the government. I don't think that interpretation is as clear in the work itself, but the fact that you can take pride in your Welshness and yet be entirely loyal to the crown, just like Ellis Wynn, is very obvious. Well, I'm going to ask Reverend Elfed Lloyd to say a few words of thanks to the speakers. So thank you, Manon. Well, it's my privilege on behalf of us all to thank Dr. Gwinllan and Professor Hugh Price for opening windows and showing us a reflection of 2 works that have been so important in our history of literature in Wales and of religion in Wales. When I was thinking about Ellis Wynn, the only thing I knew about him was that he has his name by a hymn in Emynair Eglwys, Ma fi yw'r godiad mawr. But I've been inspired to look now for a gweledigaethau'r Bawr Cwsg and read it. And the same with Professor Hugh Price. I'd love to be a fly on the wall listening to Theophilus Evans and William Pentecelyn discussing religion. And again, I've got Drych y Prif Oeser here somewhere, and I've been trying to look for it and read it. One thing that struck me during this series of presentations during the last couple of months is the way that the the great ideas and influences of the Christian church throughout the continent have been translated into Welsh and into the Welsh context, and finding the that is right way to look for a usable history for our work today. And I'd like to thank the people who have been in the background organising this series and working so effectively to ensure that the presentations have been so polished. And I look forward to the second series. Thank you very much. Well, I would like to let you know that we are preparing for the second series, and our hope is that we will have arranged 3 evenings, because we found that Saturday mornings were a bit difficult in October. So we are going to have 3 evenings, just on the same pattern as we've had on Saturday mornings this time. And we haven't yet finalised the speakers and the themes, but I know in the background there's been a lot of work going into that. If we can find get the speakers we want, the Welsh-speaking speakers we want, we'll have another feast. Look out for the emails and the notices on the social media. Just to say, there is a series of videos and webinars on the volume Goruchwylwyr Furlon, which is papers produced by the Doctrinal Commission on the Ministry, and anyone can come to those discussions. The information is on the Church in Wales website, and we're holding a discussion in Welsh about that series as well, so you're very welcome to come to that. And that's on Monday, the 21st of June at 7 o'clock. That's when the Welsh webinar will be. So just to say thank you very much for supporting this. It's been our vision to enrich our understanding, our history and heritage in the Church in Wales. And we're very thankful to all the speakers who've shared their knowledge and expertise with us. The 2 of you this morning, but everybody throughout the series. So hopefully we'll have an informal chat now with some of you. If you click the Zoom link in chat, and then we hope you will have your company in that. And thanks so much to Sean Aled for the translation as well. But above all, thank you all for being here and to the contributions, and look forward to seeing you in the autumn.